Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sonja. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Waterloo, and today I'll be taking a different angle, so there will be a little bit of overlap between Dana's presentation in the morning as well as some from Catherine and Ellen's, but I'll be actually focusing on return to work and ripple effects on the family of precariously employed workers. Alors, je vais faire la présentation en anglais. You don't want to hear me speak French for 20 minutes. So a little bit of background. Usually when a worker is injured, we find that family members actually take on a lot of additional responsibilities around the house. So this can include the physical workload in terms of rehabilitating the worker, household duties, as well as emotional support. Studies have found that there's gender role reversal, loss of intimacy between partners, and also a lot of stigmatization with injured workers being viewed as criminals when family members might not understand the severity and extent of the injuries. And this has really been exacerbated by prolonged and complex claims with multiple appeals back and forth for income supports through compensation bodies. So while we find that this has been explored more so in the traditional standard worker-employer relationship, it's rarely been discussed in the context of precariously employed and injured workers. So drawing on the larger development study between the four provinces, this study is going to actually use the Ontario data to answer three main research questions. So what is the impact of work injury and illness on families of precariously employed workers? I'll go through some of the changes that injured workers' family roles and their relationships throughout the return to work process, including how they interacted with workplace actors such as employers and compensation bodies. I keep pressing the back. So just really quickly with our methods, so our Ontario sample had 14 precariously employed injured workers. They ranged from a lot of employment contracts, including temporary agency workers, seasonal workers, part-time minimum waged workers, as well as contract workers. They were recruited through a variety of different means, such as social media, including Facebook and Buns. We also posted flyers at places that were frequented by workers, such as employment agencies, injured worker groups, online advertising, such as Kijiji and Craigslist, and a few referrals from our study partners. So between January and September 2017, we conducted one-time in-depth semi-structured interviews with injured workers. So the interview protocol basically focused mostly on their experience of return to work, including any challenges that they found in terms of with their employers and workers' compensation, which in Ontario is WSIB. And of course, another focus was what are some of the impacts that you found in terms of your return to work process with your family. So again, really quickly through the analysis, we had done an initial run-through of a handful of our transcripts to develop these deductive and inductive codes. An example of an inductive code, for example, can include didn't know. So this is where the participant is really reflecting on some of the gaps in terms of their rights for benefits or even claiming. So we developed a coding framework, which we applied through all the interviews, and it was really an interplay between data collection and analysis, so it allowed for new codes to emerge, which we then went back and coded. And then we created coded summaries, so this really allowed us to distill our findings and facilitated our in-depth analysis of key themes within and across the data, with a particular emphasis, which we went back and looked at, was family. So before I get into the findings, you'll hear me talk a little bit more about the context in terms of the role and circumstances that led to some of these impacts with family, and it had a lot to do with their relationship with employers and their relationship with WSIB. So as I go through the findings, you'll see that I might be referring to that a little bit. So the first finding was that family really provided a lot of support for the precarious injured workers following their injury and illness and throughout the return to work process, which included, first and foremost, financial support. So oftentimes workers described that their employers were using a technicality to terminate them, forcing them to rely on their family and friends as they were rehabilitating. So for Louise, she was a employee that was on probation, and she actually had to move back in with her parents because she could no longer afford her lifestyle. So she talks about you have to give up your independence, not just socially, the physical limitations. I was fortunate that my parents were taking care of everything, like my phone bills, my physio costs, and even my medical costs for prescriptions, because I didn't have any income. I was fresh out of school. So on reflection, she does talk about how she might have been very naive at that time because this was her first job and she didn't really understand the systems in place to help her. Similarly, we have Scott. He was a temporary agency worker. So as Ellen mentioned, he was working at a banquet hall, and on the day that he was working, he was paid in cash. So his employer claimed that he technically wasn't an employee on that day, and therefore they weren't accountable for the injury. So he actually, he claims his family is not in the picture, so the debts that I borrowed was all from my friends, which I'm still repaying now. And if I didn't have them, I'd be in a very, very dark place, because his foot kept him immobile for almost a year before he was able to find work. Workers also talked a lot about instrumental support. So here, at times we found that workers were really frustrated with the compensation process, especially with disinterested return to work coordinators who workers felt like were just making their situation worse than helping them. So for Yvonne, she was a part-time minimum waged worker. And she describes how the return to work coordinator came to her place of employment, but was not really interested in her needs, but rather seemed to side with the employer. And this really affected her relationship with her husband, who now also had to take on her additional responsibilities. So she says, WSIB is representing me. They're going to send me one of their people, but they don't provide the appropriate modified work. Then they go and ask, why did WSIB send me? I'm so stressed. It's been over 10 years right now. I have to take care of my body because I have a life outside of my company. It's just me and my husband. I don't have anyone else. And he has to give me a ride into work. So basically she talks about how her husband, who also has to work a manual job, now has to be her provider in terms of driving her back and forth to work. The second finding, which is a little bit larger, was that family was mostly impacted by the precarious workers' work injury, illness, and return to work process. So previously, when we saw that family was a positive addition, here we see it's more adverse for the injured worker. So we saw the demise of spousal relationships. So sometimes injured workers felt like they were being harassed by their employers who were unwilling to continue to provide modified duties. So as a result, they felt they were pushed out of work and now left without any income coming in. And this resulted in a lot of relationships breaking up. So for Seth, he was actually walked out by his HR and told, you could do a set job or you can't come back. He goes to describe, my wife and I are finished, I have that one on me. She's just waiting for this to get figured out, and we're going to decide what we're going to do with our home, whether she's going to move out and what's going to happen. It's been a complete nightmare. It's the worst thing I've ever been through. I was losing my family, not just my health. And for Seth, he also has a severely ill child, so he really depended on the income that was coming from his job, and he's still appealing the process today. For David, he was a temporary agency worker, and he actually felt that he was misguided by both his employer, which was the temp agency, as well as the client employer, who placed the blame of the injury on him and actually proceeded to dismiss him based on an incident that happened prior to this, but for which he was deemed not at fault. So when this happened, David and his wife had to deplete through their savings. She had a very part-time minimum wage position as well, and it just affected their intimacy a lot because they were fighting a lot more. So he did spare some of the details, but he goes to say, I made our life affordable. My wife, she's a waitress, or my ex-wife now. She wasn't happy. She knows I was in pain, even in the bedroom and stuff like that. We would be having our intimacy, and it sounded like someone was knocking on the door from my hip, you know. It would change things up. We were very active before. We would go out socializing and dancing. Then we have Peter, also a temporary agency worker. So he was actually discouraged by the temporary agency from filing a workers' compensation claim. He was told that temporary agency workers typically do not submit these types of claims, and he just followed what they were telling him. So he actually had to be home a lot more while he was rehabilitating. It took him a little over a year to go back to work. And his wife really was not used to this. So he describes a lot of arguments. Because I was always the one working and she was taking care of the kids, then being at home all the time, it causes more tension between me and her because she's not always used to me being around. And now I'm around more, so there's that issue too. The second sort of sub-theme within the impact on family is changes in family roles. So we see that a lot of workers went from this idea of a breadwinner or income earner to now being unemployed, financially strained, and depending on social assistance, which was a fraction of their income. So for Jason, he was a temporary agency worker as well. He really provided for his kids and his ex-wife in terms of buying them back to school, grocery, everything that they could need. But he talks about how he tries not to see them anymore because I can't afford to go to the city to get them. I avoided them for Christmas because when I'm poor, I just don't know. For Kobe, Kobe actually felt very misrepresented by WSIB. Following his injury, they claimed that his injury was very minor, it was a strain, but in fact, he required 2 surgeries for his rotator cuff injury, which kept him off of work. He was very frustrated because he had to go through multiple appeals and kept being denied. So he talks about how it really affected his relationship with his kids. He says, I have 2 little boys. I'm always playing with them, wrestling with them. And now they just don't understand. They say, Dad doesn't want to play. Other times I'm just more angry because of my situation. So I keep my anger towards them. It's a lot of frustration. It doesn't work well for a family when one person is always upset or angry based on circumstances beyond their control. And the final sort of sub-theme through here was when workers just completely withdrew from their family and friends. So in these instances, we found that some precariously employed injured workers, when they were denied modified duties but continued to work in a demanding job, which was often the case, it was very hard on them and they just were very frustrated with their situation. So for Shannon, she was a temporary agency worker who continued to work because she needed the money, of course, but her lower back injury was very painful, and she was in a caregiving position. She just felt like she didn't want to be around anyone at that point, and she fell into depression. So she goes on to say, nobody wants to be around a Debbie Downer, and I just felt like based on my circumstances, I was seriously depressed and I couldn't get out of bed. I went from being very functional and social to like nothing. I couldn't even go with them because I was in pain or I was tired. I was nauseous. I didn't sleep well. It affected my relationships with friends and family. It affected the person that I was. Similarly for Gretchen, who was a part-time minimum waged worker, she tried to submit a claim, but she found that her employer did not believe the severity of her injury. And as we saw from Ellen's presentation, she was also a dog walker. So the employer actually said, well, the injury could be based on your side job of dog walking. And they didn't want to really submit the Form 7 for her. She felt like her self-esteem was crushed at that point, which affected her relationship with her mom, and she also ended up breaking up with her boyfriend at the time. So she says, I should have reported sooner than I did, but I was hoping it would get better, and it felt like it was a crummy job to begin with, and if they could reject me, and if they could accuse me of lying, then it really damaged my self-esteem, and I figured, well, what good am I, you know? And the final sort of finding is when some injured workers in our study actually ended up sheltering their families completely from not only their injury, but their return to work process and problems that they were experiencing with their employers and WSIB. So for Victor, he was a contract worker. His family lived in China. So following his ankle injury, which actually prevented him from returning to normal duties for 3 years, it caused 2 car accidents, and he actually had to undergo multiple surgeries as well. But he just pretended everything was fine because he didn't want to worry his family and make them come over when they already had limited income. And with this, he fell into depression, which he coped by seeing a therapist once a week. Similarly, Brenda, who's a part-time minimum wage worker, she experienced the eye injury, and she found that her constant appeals to her employer to submit the Form 7, which she eventually did on the last day, resulted in a really tense and awkward relationship, and she felt really blacklisted by him, and she fell into bouts of anxiety, which she kept from her mom, largely because her mom was happy that she was just able to see, so she didn't want to worry her any further. So she goes to say, I was worried that I would lose my job because of the accident, right? And I was worried that my relationship with my boss would change, and that actually happened. He was not confident with me, and so I had to leave. And so that was the only way that she figured she was able to cope. So just concluding a little bit in my last few minutes here. The findings from this analysis of the Ontario data, what it really found was that workers following a work injury or illness, and in terms of their relationship with the complex WSIB rules and oftentimes disinterested employers, really had an effect on a lot of their mental health and well-being, which trickled into effects on their family as well. So there was really this inherent sort of power imbalance with injured workers and their families having access to less resources than employers and WSIB. So it would be interesting in the future development grant to really look at this a little bit more from the perspective of employers, because oftentimes our workers described how employers were sometimes falling through these loopholes in terms of their obligations for providing accommodation or for reintegrating them back into the workforce. Thank you.